All right, guys, welcome. This module is titled The American Revolution. That might be a bit of a misleading title. This is actually going to be a relatively short uh, module. The American Revolution, it was an event, obviously, but it was a process. It was a period, right? So a lot of the stuff we talked about last time with the different taxes being put into place, that's all considered part of the revolutionary period. And then the shooting war begins with where we left off last time, Lexington and Concord, although some argue it began years earlier with the Boston Massacre. But this unit is short because we're just going to talk about declaring independence and then kind of really quickly bullet point go through the period of the actual kinetic shooting war. I mean, that lasted almost 10 years, just that phase of it. What we'll spend a lot more time on in the next unit is the aftermath of the physical conflict, wherein the United States had to figure out how to set up a new government, right? And that's where we'll spend the bulk of the time in this course on the Revolutionary Era, the period when the shooting has stopped and now it's time to figure out how to set up an independent country. And specifically, we'll spend quite a bit of time on the Constitution because that is, I think, most relevant in terms of understanding the country today, especially the Bill of Rights. So again, for those reasons, this will be a relatively short unit just to kind of bridge the first third of the course that we've covered where the United States doesn't even exist. Now, from here on out, after this unit, the United States will exist, and the second half of the course roughly will be about the early history of the United States. So, Declaration of Independence, I hope you're all familiar with the this document to some degree. I've highlighted the language that I want to spend time on, and just to make sure that you are familiar with the language and that you understand the ideas behind the foundation of this country. Um, these are, I think "are" is a fair word. Let's say were. Let's go back in time. When these words were originally written, they were profoundly radical. And I would argue that they still are. But let's look at the context of the time when this was written. So this is Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, for most Americans, it's just a slogan. It's a bumper sticker. It's a hashtag, whatever. It's just this casual thing. Oh yeah, all men are created equal. Please take a moment to pause and do not take this for granted. That was the most radical thing in the political sphere that had ever been written. The idea that all men, and in the parlance of the time, they basically meant all people, are created equal. I need to stress this. Nobody outside of the Bible had ever said anything remotely like that, ever. This is a radical thing to say, the idea that all people are equal. So now we can just casually gloss over that. Well, the only reason we have that luxury is that that idea took hold and now is widely accepted in theory. Um, Now it's just a normal thing. Oh, I'm going to create equal. That was one of the most radical things that had ever been put to paper. So I want to urge you not to just gloss over that, but understand how earth-changing that was. Now, let's take a quick aside. The person who wrote that, Thomas Jefferson, as I'm sure you probably know, owned slaves. So to put it mildly, he was not practicing what he preached. We know that, right? This is an incredibly flawed, complex person, as most of us are. So we can condemn him for hypocrisy, and maybe that's a worthwhile thing to do. Maybe we should be running around the country tearing down statues of Thomas Jefferson. Many people are. That's fine. But the fact that he wrote this down, I want to urge you to balance, oh, he was a hypocrite. He didn't really mean it. Okay. He still said it and it still took hold, theoretically. That's a big deal. So all men are created equal. Do not take that for granted. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay. According to this document, where do we get our rights? We get our rights from God, from the creator. If you're not comfortable with that language, if you're atheist, for example, no problem. You still have these rights. If you don't want to say they're from God or your creator, say that they're natural rights. Say that they're from birth. Say that the key is you have them automatically from Jefferson said God. If you're not comfortable with that, just say from birth. They're unalienable. Now, here's what's equally radical about this phrase. It's as important for what it doesn't say as for what it does. We get our rights from God or from birth. Okay. Well, that means that we don't get our rights from the government. And that is of radical importance. You don't get your rights from the government. And again, no one in a position of political authority had ever said anything like this before. I'm going to say it a third time because it's worth it. You don't get your rights from the government. Why is that important? For all of human history before this, what rights did people have at any given time, in any given place? They had the right to do whatever their government felt like letting them do. If you get your rights from the government can take your rights away. But if you get your rights from God or from birth, they are unalienable. They cannot be taken away. So if we don't get our rights from the government, if we have them automatically, why do we even need a government? To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's the job of the government. Again, this is all the theory behind this document. If you don't agree with it, fine. If you think we fail to live up to it, yeah. But the theory, all right, I want to make sure you understand the theory. The government's job is not to give us rights. We have them from our creator. The government's job is to protect our rights. For example, I have the right to life. If you try to kill me, that's where the government steps in the form of the police. What's their job? To protect my rights from you taking them away. Not to give me my rights, I already have them, but to protect them. To secure these rights, that's why we have government. Where do governments get their power, according to this? From the consent of the governed, from us, usually through the process of voting for or against people in the government. What do we have the right to do when our government starts abusing our rights rather than protecting them? We have the right to alter, change it by voting people out, or abolish it and start a new one. Now, I don't suggest that you attempt to abolish our government and start a new one. I don't think that would end well for you. But Jefferson's putting that in there because he has to that's what he's doing at this very moment, right? He's abolishing the current government to start a new one. So he has to justify what he's doing. But you have the right to alter the government by voting people out of office. So those foundational principles are very important. I just want to stipulate, make sure you're familiar with those ideas, and specifically that you don't take for granted how radical those ideas are, or certainly were. They're not as radical anymore because multiple other countries all over the world have copied them. That's why they're not radical anymore. They've become common on paper, in theory. Okay. In practice, that's a whole nother conversation. The majority really of the document, he has this, he has that, he has that. He, in this case, is the King of England, and this is a list of grievances, complaints. Happy people don't start revolutions. So Jefferson, after his introduction of his philosophy, the majority of the document is he has done this, he has done that. It's a list of grievances or complaints against the king to justify, in Jefferson's mind, what he's doing. Signatures from the 13 original colonies. And the last thing I highlighted that I want to spend a minute on, super important to understand, especially with early American history, and to consider how things have changed. The Declaration of Independence does not say the United States is an independent country. It doesn't say that. Look at what it says. All of the language is plural. These, plural. United colonies, plural. Are, plural. Free and independent states, plural. They, plural. Ba, 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 ba. Independent states. It doesn't say the United States is independent. It says the United States are independent. That is of great importance for you to consider. The further we go back in our history, the more our country was viewed as a plural thing. The United States are, not the United States is. That's how we talk now. The United States is. No, no, no. That's relatively new. The United States are. We were a collection of independent things. When we get to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. For better or for worse, over the course of American history, this attitude has been severely degraded to the point where now, if I say the United States are, that doesn't sound right to you, right? It's like, what's this guy saying? No, it's the United States is. We've all been conditioned and educated to think of our country as one unitary thing, and in many ways it is, of course. But the further you go back in our history, that wasn't the dominant paradigm. The dominant paradigm was that the United States is a collection, kind of like maybe the European Union today. Yeah, it's one thing, but it's also not at the same time. It's also separate independent pieces. So it says the United States are, not is, right? And just that one word, right? Which word you use depends on which period of American history we're talking about. That has changed radically over time. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which has to do with states' rights. This is something that was cut out of the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the final draft that I just showed you. It starts with he has, so it's another complaint, grievance against the king. And it's calling out the king for his role in the slave trade. He's waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating sacred rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. Who were those distant people? The West Africans who were enslaved. He capitalizes the word Christian to draw attention to the fact that in Jefferson's opinion, being involved with slavery is not Christian behavior. He capitalizes the word men to stress the fact that these are men, these are human beings being treated like animals or property. Really passionate denunciation of the slave trade in the Declaration of Independence. Now, again, the person writing this impassioned defense of the humanity of the slaves also owned slaves. So good luck figuring that out. Also, this was in the rough draft, but it was taken out of the final draft. It's not in the final Declaration of Independence. Why was it taken out? The colonies that relied heavily on slavery, some of them refused to sign off on the document unless this was taken out. So this was a political calculation, not a moral one. the 13 colonies understood that they had to all be on the same page. They had to be united to have any chance of winning the revolution. And therefore, they basically had a policy of when we're voting on what we're going to say and what we're going to do, like we need it to be 13 to nothing. It has to be unanimous. We have to be together on this. And there were some colonies, not all of the southern colonies rejected this, but enough to where the decision was made that if we include this, what you see here in the final Declaration of Independence, some of the southern colonies that rely heavily on slavery will not join in the cause. And therefore, as you know, I think the issue of slavery was not addressed at this point, was not abolished at this point. That issue was put off, delayed, kicked down the road for another 75 or 80 years until ultimately it was settled during the Civil War period, which we'll cover at the end of this course. So really quickly, just a broad uh, kind of 30,000 feet view of the politics of, what happened during the Revolution. British officials took it for granted that colonials, in this context, they mean Americans, cannot be granted the same rights as Britons, specifically the right to vote. So we talked briefly in the last unit about no taxation without representation. So this is the House of Commons. This is the British Parliament. The House of Commons and the House of Lords, they have two chambers just like we do. They might all be in the same room. I'm not really sure exactly how it works. But this basically is the Parliament in England. And it's been in that room for centuries. Long story short, it's a small room because it's a small parliament because it's a small country. And when the British had this huge empire, they had to make this decision, not just in America, but everywhere else. Are we going to give people in the empire the right to vote? This was the British Empire at its peak 100 years ago, well after the United States was independent. That's why the United States is not red on this, but it was the same principle. At its peak, this is the British Empire. They controlled half of Africa. They controlled India. Now, do you think the British are going to give people in India the right to vote and be represented in the British Parliament? Because if they did and gave India representation based on their population, this room would be like 75% representatives from India and, 20% representatives from Africa. That room, the British Parliament, if everyone that the British governed had voting rights for representation, there'd be like two British people in the entire parliament, maybe. The parliament will be dominated by Indians and Africans, and the British weren't going to allow that. Now, during the American Revolutionary period, and look, you could easily casually say, well, it's because of racism. Well, surely that was a part of it, but during the American Revolutionary period, there's the same calculation made, and race wasn't a factor in this calculation. It was a political calculation. If the British allowed American colonists to have representation in London, the majority of the people in Parliament would not be from London, they'd be from New York and Philadelphia and Virginia. And they weren't going to allow that. And that almost guaranteed a revolution. By the way, just as with the British Empire at its peak here, one of the reasons many of these countries, essentially all of them, broke away from the British Empire, there were many reasons, but one of them was we have no representation. We have no say in the governing of our own country. Pretty good motive to start a revolution for independence, right? So whether it's Gandhi in India or Thomas Jefferson in the United States 200 years earlier, the principle's the same. There was division among Americans that is important for you to understand because in retrospect, Americans look back at the revolution as inherently good and we were the good guys and we won and it was a great idea. And of course, it had to happen that way. And that's all hindsight. Um, there was no agreement at the time that this was the right thing to do. Now, I don't know about these percentages. I could, mm, uh, I think maybe the loyalists percentage might have been a little bit higher. I don't know. But the point is, there was division, clear division throughout the American population on is this a good idea? Meaning declaring war on Great Britain, right? On the British Empire to separate. Is that a good idea? Significant numbers of people were neutral. There was support, and there was what were called the loyalists. So let's go through each group really quickly and think about their arguments, their perspective. Loyalists were people that did not want to declare independence. They were loyal to the British, to the king. They wanted to remain part of the British Empire. What were their arguments? Um, they argued a couple things. Number one, things aren't that bad. The British aren't that bad. Everyone complains about their government. That's what people do. I do that. I'm sure you do too. People complain about their governments everywhere, forever, for all time. Um, the loyalists were basically saying you got to be really careful what you wish for. Don't assume that if you separate from the British, that whatever comes next will automatically be better, because we don't know that. And there are many times in history, many, many, many times when people start a revolution and then regret it. A lot of people hated the Roman Empire well over 1,000 years before the American Revolution. And a lot of people wanted the empire gone, the Roman Empire. And then when the Roman Empire fell, there was something called the Dark Ages. And for most people, things got a lot worse for like 1,000 years. And a lot of people who hated the Roman Empire afterwards, who had a hell of a hangover and thought, boy, maybe they weren't that bad. You don't know what's going to come next. That's part of what the loyalists said. And the other thing they pointed out was declaring war on the British Empire is suicide. We can't possibly win. That was another argument they made. The Patriots, their argument was no, we're big enough and strong enough that we should be an independent country. We should not be controlled by this island on the other side of the ocean, especially when we can't even vote for our own government. Pretty straightforward. The neutrals were just normal people like you and I that don't want war. They want to be left alone to live their lives and raise their kids and just like leave me out of this. They didn't really think their lives would radically change regardless of what happened, so they just wanted to be left alone. All right, so there was division. The text points out the British lost more than battles. They alienated civilians. Now, in a war like this, where there's an empire involved, there's a really powerful, much more powerful country on one side, and the weaker side is fighting to get that powerful army out. Very often, the more powerful side will lose those wars. The British lost this war. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. And that happens very often. It is very difficult for a powerful army to win a war in someone else's country if they don't want you there, because it becomes an issue of time. The powerful army has to be willing to stay and fight indefinitely. And it might take years. It might take 5 years. It might take 20 years. It might take 50 years. And eventually they're going to get tired and they're going to leave. And when that happens, the weaker force wins by default. So the weaker force, if they're on their home turf, if they're in their country, they don't need to win. They just need to not lose. They need to be willing to fight one day longer than the powerful empire. And eventually the empire will get tired and go home. And one of the reasons that empires have a hard time winning wars like this is that the people in the country where the war is will turn against the powerful force, even if they supported them earlier. So here's an example of that. The British, they're the foreign army in this case, alienated the very civilians whose loyalties they'd hoped to ensure. In New York City, the presence of the British Army brought shortages of food and housing. This is basic supply and demand. There's a big British Army that comes into New York City. Maybe a lot of people in New York City were loyalists and were on the side of the British. A lot of them were. So you might say, if you lived in New York, I want to be part of the British Empire. We think it's better this way. We support the British. But then they move into your city with a big army and supply and demands. The supply of people goes way up really quick. The supply of housing didn't go up really quick. The supply of food didn't magically increase really quick, but the supply of people did. So the demand for housing goes up because there's more people, but the supply of housing did not go up. And now all of a sudden rent is super expensive. And now, in that case, if you supported the British earlier, now you might resent them and want them out. Like, hey, ever since the British showed up, rent and groceries are unaffordable because of supply and demands. Same thing in Philadelphia. British occupation. You have foreign soldiers. Where are they going to sleep? What are they going to eat? Jacked up the prices. Inflation. Too many people chasing too few goods. Again, big army moves into Philadelphia. There aren't going to magically be 10,000 new houses built. That doesn't happen overnight. So it causes inflation. The soldiers are on the streets. They're trampling people's gardens. They're physically there. And after a while, that causes resentment. And then people who were loyal might switch sides. And that's a timeless thing throughout all world history. A powerful army losing a long war to a weaker force, not because they're militarily defeated, but because politically, economically, psychologically, you can't stay in someone's country forever. The United States learned that in Vietnam. We learned that more recently in Afghanistan. The United States lost the war in Afghanistan. Our military wasn't defeated. Nobody can defeat our military. We should be very thankful for that. That's not a thing. You're not going to defeat the American military. So how do we lose a war in Afghanistan against the Taliban? Did they beat us? No, they didn't beat us. They outlasted us. We were there for 20 years and ultimately lost the political will to stay there. And the day after we left, the Taliban won. They were willing to wait one day longer than we were. So what are we supposed to do? Stay there 50 years? It's the same thing with the British in America. They can't stay forever. So as long as we keep fighting, eventually we will win by default. Another very common thing that we see throughout history is, well, we talked about this briefly, I think, a couple units ago with Native Americans helping the Spanish against the Aztecs. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. France jumped into the American Revolution on the side of the Americans against the British. Why? Did they love us? Did they care about us? No. They saw an opportunity to stick it to the British. The French were enemies with the British. Therefore, they became our quote friends because we had a common enemy. We both, for different reasons, were enemies with the British, so we teamed up. It was just convenience. France had been waiting for an opportunity to humble Britain ever since the Seven Years' War. We talked about that very briefly in the last unit. The French and the British were at war on and off for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so they jumped into the revolution on our side in order to weaken their enemy. And everyone who studies this in great detail has a consensus that without the French, we would not have won the war certainly as soon as we did. Right? It took 8 years to win the war. Without the French, the French help was serious and pivotal. And without their help, the war might have lasted another, we don't know, significantly longer. Okay. So this was a big deal. Another issue that came up for debate in different contexts during the war was, again, slavery. British leaders considered um, offering freedom to slaves in return for fighting on the side of the British. But they made, again, a political, not moral calculus that would do more harm than good for the British cause because there were a lot of loyalists, pro-British people in the South, and the British realized if they basically encouraged a slave revolt, there would be no white loyalists in the South. So the British did not follow through with this plan. They considered it but didn't follow through, based again, it's kind of a trend here with decisions involving slavery during this period being driven by uh, tactical political decisions or concerns rather than moral concerns. Last thing, just to wrap this up, and then we'll spend a considerable amount of time on the Constitution and the early Republic in the coming units. The Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ended the war. It was a diplomatic triumph for the American negotiators. Well, yeah, for a couple of reasons. So look at the map. Two major things. Number one, it ended the war with the United States victorious. So obviously that's a big deal. And it recognized for the first time, if you look at the map in green, US, right? Any map of the Americas at any time before 1783 is not going to have something called the United States. And now, starting in 1783 and continuing to today, yeah, that's going to be on the map. The United States is a thing. So that was obviously a huge victory. That was the primary goal of the war from the American perspective. So the United States is recognized by the British, by the Spanish, and others as an independent country, not part of the British Empire, an independent country. It's a big deal. What it also did is, if you look at the map there and look at what's in green, the original colonies that fought the revolution were just the East Coast of the United States, as you know. This treaty not only gave independence to the United States, it basically tripled the size of the country, right? Because look at now the United States extends far beyond the eastern seaboard, far beyond the coast. Like the western boundary of the United States during the Revolution in New England, for example, was, the border of New Hampshire. I mean, that's, at its narrowest point, which would have been, I believe, at New Hampshire, the United States, the colonies were like, I don't know, 30 miles wide, maybe. And now the entire country, again, not only is independent, but is well over double the size that it was just the day before. Now it goes all the way to the Mississippi River. That's huge. That's a lot all at once. That's a major victory. The Mississippi River is economically by far the most important river on Earth. It's not even close. It is not only huge, but it is very easily navigated. It's a huge economic driver. I mean, you can sail from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico on the Mississippi River. It's an enormous economic advantage. And this sets up the United States to become, the most influential military and economic force on Earth eventually. This is the beginning of that. So this is a major triumph, to put it lightly. Now, one of the decisions that's going to need to be made with all of that new territory, we'll get to this in the next unit, is, or the unit after probably, is what do we do with all this new territory? What does the United States do? Do they add a bunch of new states? Are they enormous states or small states or medium states? Are those states going to be added as equal members with the original states, even though the original states were there first? What is going to be done with the Native American populations? What is the policy going to be on slavery in the new states, right? And all of those complex issues are going to cause serious division, as you probably know. All right, so again, that's just kind of a short bridge unit, just to cover the period of the war itself. And as I said at the beginning, what I think is much more relevant to understanding current events and the landscape today is not, who won the Battle of Saratoga, but what what are the foundational principles of the Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights, and how do we see those at work today? So we'll spend quite a bit of time on that next time, and I will see you then.